In 1981, a broke kid from Michigan drove out to a freezing cabin with a chainsaw, a 16mm camera, and about $350,000 that he had to beg out of a couple of dentists and some family friends. He thought he was just making one little horror movie. Little did he know the monster he was creating would go on to infect an entire genre for the next 44 years. And it's never stopped spreading. Because here's the thing, folks, I've got 8 films right here that are basically Evil Dead sequels. Some of them share DNA, one of them shares an actual on-screen prop, one of them straight up is the original, and even as recently as this year, we've had one of these films confirmed to be set in the same universe as our beloved Deadites. So good evening, campers, dreamers, and babysitters, and welcome back to another list, where today we're tracing the bloodline of 8 movies that are basically Evil Dead.
Who's laughing
Well, we got to start somewhere, and why not at the very grain of the idea of the Evil Dead? And that is pretty much the blueprint here, 1978's Within the Woods. Now, this is a proof of concept. I think all Evil Dead fans are going to already know the information here. This being that proof of concept, which is like, what, a half hour, just to try and get the idea of the Evil Dead out there. And I remember hearing about this way back when it was just the message board forums and hearing about Within the Woods. I hadn't seen it until more recently. I think this is available on YouTube right now, but you can kind of just see where this all started. You feel that kinetic energy that Sam Raimi has with the camera. You see the things that, man, if we could just have a bigger budget is what everyone says, I can really get something off the ground. You see just the heart that this franchise has. And that's why I love going back into this one, just to reminisce about, hey, this is such a DIY franchise. And I think that's why we hold this near and dear to our hearts, is because we see where Sam Raimi is and we see where Evil Dead is as a franchise now, but we get to see where it all started. And you don't get that with some of the bigger horror franchises, just to see, hey, we started with this small idea. We got a group of people together. We ran out to the woods into a cabin, and you actually get to physically see that on screen.
I agree. I mean, as a longtime Evil Dead fan myself, yes, this is something that I was so over the moon excited about when I first heard about it. It's definitely a piece that is one of those movies that I think it's not necessary to watch it, but if you're already a fan of Evil Dead and you've been watching these movies for years, this is such a fun little bonus round that we get to go back to. Yes, it's 30 minutes, and to be honest, it's really not that hard to find. There are plenty of versions of it that have been put on YouTube. It's very accessible right now, but it is very much the same crew who made the Evil Dead. This is the thing they tried to do to get kind of like their jump start, kind of me, like Luke said, a proof of concept. And I think even though it's very rough around the edges and some scenes are impossible to decipher what the hell's going on, I still think there's a lot of fun here for Evil Dead fans. And yeah, I think it goes to say that even on the official like Evil Dead wiki, this is considered a part of canon. This is considered the very first nuggets or the jumping off point for Evil Dead Within the Woods.
It is the prototype, and it's like we get to kind of see the raw version of Evil Dead birthed onto film, and we kind of get to relive that and see what Sam Raimi's initial idea was and how we get to expand upon that, because we also do get to see some ideas replicated from Within the Woods into that first Evil Dead film. And that's what I really love about this, because like you said, yeah, it's very raw, it's very rough around the edges, but you get to see that grain of an idea. And like I said, this is very much that DIY project of we've all been there, where it says, man, if we just had a budget, we could really do something with this. And I think you get inspired by that little half hour, that little grain of an idea, because there's some gory bits, there's some really interesting narrative, and then we get to actually relive that into that feature film of The Evil Dead.
Run, Judy, run!
Next up, we gotta go with the immediate descendant. Yes, this is one that followed directly after the release of Evil Dead 2. So right when Evil Dead was kind of getting to, I guess, the peak of its power. Some would argue maybe a little later. I would say this is where the peak of Evil Dead's influence started to shine in the indie space, because 1988's Night of the Demons is certainly a wacky, wild, sex-pesty kind of ride that we have on our hands here. And I certainly think that it's one of those movies that, without a shadow of a doubt, you look at it, you see all the set pieces, just how weird and wild these demons, aka very Deadite-esque, are doing and what they are doing. And it's just no wonder this takes inspiration from Sam Raimi and team here. And for a lot of people, it's kind of the perfect example to go to, again, for just something that came out at the same time Evil Dead was basically peaking and tried to recreate that magic. Some people love this movie. I think it's pretty good. But I think this is also one of those things where it's a little bit of flattery. You know what I mean? It's a little bit of, this is what's hot right now. And this movie probably wouldn't be the same way without it.
Judy, Roger, where you going? The party's just begun.
I do have a soft spot for Night of the Demons. I love that period of horror filmmaking from like 85 to 89. It just has some really interesting concepts, and you can honestly see that direct influence from Evil Dead. I know that I think the director had come out and said, this is something that I was very much influenced by Evil Dead 2. You kind of see that it's like an escalating supernatural chaos, that you have from the Evil Dead franchise with the Deadites, because it's like you look at 70s supernatural, you can point to The Exorcist, very somber, very dark, and they take that into a very grounded level where it's like when you get into Evil Dead, especially Evil Dead 2, you get the comedic tones, you get that blatant chaos that I think Night of the Demons certainly exploits, and I think it really finds an audience because of the Evil Dead. And I really enjoy Night of the Demons because it's such a kindred spirit for Evil Dead, where the demons are very Deadite-esque, like you said. They really do have some haunting imagery in here that I think, man, when you see Stooge completely burnt by the end of it, that is something that is burned into my brain that is really scary stuff, but it also has an enjoyable comedy. You really get to see that mesh of comedy with horror, which I always talk about. It doesn't always work, but I think using Evil Dead 2 as that kind of blueprint for Night of the Demons, that's why this film actually works and it's fun to go back to.
Yeah, I mean, it's the complete Raimi engine, I think is the best word to put on there. It's like they finally figured out a way to kind of bottle the Evil Dead formula in a sense. Now, not saying it's anywhere near as great or as pure as the original stuff, but Night of the Demons from 1988 certainly deserves a little bit of praise when we're talking about just trying to find that Evil Dead magic.
Well, now we get to see the Deadites invade another established horror franchise, and that is an unofficial crossover with Friday the 13th in Jason Goes to Hell. What a intriguing film. This is such a different vibe than everything else we've seen in the Friday the 13th franchise, but I think there's so much fun to be had in this. I know this is a very divisive film within the horror space, and hell, I hated this one for a very long time until a few years ago I decided to actually sit down and dissect this one a little bit more. I started appreciating how different this one feels. I mean, we're having characters throw up in other characters' mouths to transfer the spirit of Jason Voorhees. It really does feel like we're ripping some of the Evil Dead formula and making it intertwine with Friday the 13th and somehow finding some sort of coherent narrative. And again, this one has that comedic tone We have a different display of characters with the age groups and kind of more so being in the town itself, and just that splattery violence. And hell, we have a direct reference with the Necronomicon in this. So it's like, hey, we get to tie in actually Jason Voorhees as a Deadite. Adam Marcus was very cerebral in the intent here. He wanted to do something like that. And I think that's why people are coming around to appreciating this. I don't want to say this one is getting a lot of love right at this moment, but I think some more people are coming around to Jason Goes to Hell.
I have to agree. I am one of those people as well who's starting to come around to it. I think it's just because I mainly enjoy a lot of what this movie was trying to do once you understand the story behind it a little bit more and why exactly Jason Goes to Hell. It's just so damn weird and such a departure, especially at the time. And the real fact of the matter is that Adam Marcus did not get any kind of say-so from the studio or any kind of, hey, you're good to do this. And to be honest, I don't hate the idea of Pamela Voorhees, at least in this iteration, maybe using the book or somebody using the book to resurrect Jason. We would later go on to see something like Freddy versus Jason versus Ash, which is a comic book series which people want desperately to be adapted, and that directly spawns from this film and this, as well as, well, Jason Goes to Hell's very iconic ending.
You know, this is the bridging that gap between Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. And that's what everyone left the theater talking about, as we would later get Freddy versus Jason. But when you look at it, they have that sprinkle of the Necronomicon in here. So it's like it tying in the actual Evil Dead franchise. And I think this just shows how Evil Dead is so versatile in its storytelling, in those elements that Sam Raimi had created way back when with Within the Woods and Evil Dead eventually, that we can really just sprinkle this franchise and its elements into other juggernaut horror franchises.
Now, I know I kind of said this with Night of the Demon, that, you know, flattery is kind of the biggest compliment. You know, it's always exciting to see influence. But 1995's Bloody Muscle Bodybuilder in Hell, aka the Japanese Evil Dead. And I love everything about it. It is certainly something that I just did not know about this before this project. And wow, it's an incredible story.
I just covered some Hidden Gem Fever Dreams, and boy, oh boy, is this one certainly a contender, because I hadn't watched this one. I had heard of it, but never got around, never had an excuse to sit down and watch this one. And you could just see that DIY filmmaking, and that's why I think Evil Dead is so different. It's got that DIY ripple effect, and it's like it even reaches, it's got that international flavor. You see that global reach of Evil Dead, and you don't see that often, where someone gets inspired enough to say, hey, I can get a camera, I can create my own kind of story and somehow wrap it into an Evil Dead universe. And you easily see that influence here. A Japanese version of what they call the Evil Dead is still running like a well-oiled machine with that splattery, gory horror, because that is oozing out of this quite literally, because it goes into some really wild places. And I love that this small franchise that just started with that Within the Woods in 1978 has that global reach by the mid-90s to say, hey, I'm interested enough in this franchise to make something that is very influenced by it.
And I think it should also be noted that just like Evil Dead, this movie is a one-man passion project. The director, Shinjichi Fukuzawa, wore basically every hat on this production. Like, he was doing effects, he was camera work, acting, all things. It's really just a one-man show, and that's exactly how Sam Raimi basically was doing it, with just him and his friends in a cabin back in the day. And yeah, it takes place New Year's Day with, of course, this bodybuilder in hell. But it's one of those things to me where it's like, once, like you said, you get into the house, you get everything there, you start to see all the Evil Dead come in, and it's like, oh, this is fantastic. And might I say, that final Deadite, I guess we'll call it, that he faces at the end is quite a disturbing thing. Probably up there as one of the most disturbing Deadite-esque kind of critters I think I've seen in a long time.
Now we get to see Sam Raimi step back into horror and refine his own formula, in a sense, with 2009's Drag Me to Hell. I'm going to go back to the message boards on the internets and everyone just raving about Sam Raimi's stepping back into horror after the Spider-Man trilogy, and how much of a shared DNA this has with the actual Evil Dead franchise, because you can certainly see it. That kind of mixture of comedy with the horror, we get to see Sam Raimi at his finest here. And I think that's why this was such a happy surprise, especially where horror was in 2009.
You could see that he wanted to do something like Evil Dead influenced, you know? It's like he kind of wants to do what everybody else is doing, where it's not necessarily an official installment, but you could very much see it being his own unofficial Evil Dead movie. Like, that's really how I look at Drag Me to Hell. It's such a fun little cousin film, because yes, the demons in this movie have shades of Deadites. They have their own kind of sadistic comedy that's very horrifying, adding a ton of tonal whiplashes. And this movie is at times extremely impactful. I love the scene in the parking garage that everybody talks about. I just talked about it not too long ago. And yeah, to me, this is, I think, as close to kind of, I guess, paying homage to yourself as you can get. And at the same time, it is just him really, I guess, coming back from the big studio Spider-Man 3 fame and just getting to sit back in his own little world again and just get his feet wet. Because yeah, obviously it would take more time before he comes back to do more horror, but this definitely is another feather in the Raimi cap, in my opinion.
And I think, you know, he really did prove himself coming out of the Spider-Man trilogy, and us wondering, is Sam Raimi going to still have that flavor that he had with the Evil Dead franchise? And you get to see those elements at play here. Like you said, the parking garage scene where you have this off-putting humor, very influenced by Evil Dead. And when you look at this, the curse element here as well. Like, what if we took Evil Dead out of a cabin in the woods and we put it right in, you know, middle America? We're working in an office and we're dealing with day-to-day issues rather than just one terrifying night. And I think this one really works really well with that blend of more modern comedy, more modern horror. And we get to see Sam Raimi just more polished at the craft in horror. We really get to see that vision from 1978 and that trajectory that he's had with his career into 2009, having all those elements to play with.
Giant bomb in your father's van? What are you, stoned?
And that takes us into the next pick here with the meta homage and a bit of a stroll down memory lane for both old Luke and I with The Cabin in the Woods from 2012.
It's gonna be a long weekend if everyone's that puckered up. So you want to come over Monday night? I'm going to pick up some power drills, liberate my cabinets. Are you even listening to me?
The Cabin in the Woods is, in a lot of ways, the Scream New Nightmare approach to the Evil Dead. You have a bunch of 20-somethings played by closer to 30-somethings going out to a cabin in the woods, finding a bunch of cursed objects and having this zombie redneck family, as they're called, go in and absolutely brutalize them.
Congratulations, go to maintenance. who share the pot with Ronald the intern.
Hey, that's not fair. I had zombies too.
Yes, you did. Yes, you had zombies. But this is zombie redneck torture family, see? They're entirely separate species. It's like the difference between an elephant and an elephant seal.
Thank you.
But there's always next year.
But there's a bit of a twist to that, because yes, like we said, this is very meta, and it's not just that, but all of our characters have a role to play, and it's up to the people, I guess you'd say downstairs, upstairs, the ones controlling the situation to make sure that those roles are fulfilled. Now, Luke, Cabin in the Woods, let's talk about it.
I had a bit of a volatile relationship with Cabin in the Woods because I had watched this unprompted, never saw a trailer for it, just was popping up in terms of like best horror of the year. I went back and watched this when I had a digital copy of it, expecting a pure horror film, and I did not get that. Like you said, a very, very heavy meta take. I think it takes meta even a step further with this kind of being on a reality show without actually being on a reality show, as we're facilitating these events and I guess deconstructing cabin horror, that whole formula in a sense.
In the cellar? So that shit you're playing with. They made us choose. They made us choose how we die.
And we get to see them facilitate with pheromones that are being pumped into the cabin. We have the whole whiteboard with all of our different killers and threats that are going to be happening. It is fun for what it is, and how you said we have each character that plays a particular role and how we see them fall in line after they're being manipulated, in a sense where it's like Chris Hemsworth starts off as this really genuine feeling guy. We have that moment where he's trying to guide one of our characters at the very beginning, where he's giving her a book to be like, read this, and it's like, oh man, there's some texture to this character. But then later on, as we even call out that he's falling into this like kind of dumb jock role, and we really just see that deconstruction. And I think this one leans heavily on Evil Dead, and that's why I think this film is so beloved, because you have that texture of the Evil Dead with the meta texture into making it something of its own. It really kind of, I feel like in a sense, while it celebrates horror, it does celebrate the Evil Dead specifically.
I completely agree. Yeah, I think that it definitely, it does go through many other movies, and I think that's kind of what we're all like remembering this movie about, especially once we get into the third act and we find out, you know, all the inner workings of how this cabin and or these other cabins around the world, how they operate and keep these creatures, these monsters, these demons contained. If you're a horror fan in general, just like us, everybody's going to basically be Leo DiCaprio from, you know, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, just pointing and saying, hey, look at that. I know what that is. I've seen that before. And you know what? Cabin in the Woods, it's always a good time for me.
Bringing the Evil Dead into a more modern era, I guess you would say the modern mutation, is 2022's DEADSTREAM. This honestly feels like, what if Ash Williams became a social media influencer to a certain extent, I think, where we have that found footage aspect. We have our main character going into the supposedly haunted, abandoned house and calling out spirits. And we get very Deadite-esque spirits haunting him. And we find that fun flavor of horror and comedy here through a found footage lens. We have that actual live stream going on. So it has that perfect comedic timing that we don't necessarily get in a lot of horror films, but it also has that kind of human interaction or technological interaction, I guess, whatever you want to call it, with people helping him out or calling him out and having that high tense situation of horror, but also implementing those moments of offbeat comedy. And I think that's where DEADSTREAM certainly excels.
Guilty!
This movie eluded me for a while, and I hate that it did, because yeah, this is definitely a love letter to things like Evil Dead, but definitely giving it that modern tinge. I mean, you can clearly see that, Joseph and Vanessa Winter, they're fans of both found footage, but also the same kind of gross out, over the top humor that Raimi is into. And you see that in both this and their VHS segment. As much of an influence as it has from Evil Dead, it also paves the way forward for people to kind of, mess with the framing of the Evil Dead or Deadite-like things, or just cursed objects in general. Like, it doesn't always have to be a cabin, doesn't always have to be a book, but we can get Deadites or Deadite kind of creatures that really do make for some fun and very memorable interactions throughout this one.
Oddly enough, I think Deadstream really does showcase the versatility of Evil Dead, just because, like, hey, this is a found footage subgenre. This is very influencer based, but we also find that in with Evil Dead feel to it. They really do encapsulate that Raimi energy, I think, because once we get into the house, it really does pick up with that relentless pace that Evil Dead also has. I'll call back right to Within the Woods and that first Evil Dead film, when we know about the small budgets, the obstacles that they had to go through. I think this shows that independent filmmaking spirit where it's like, hey, I can do what they did. And I think that's why Deadstream exists with a horror franchise like Evil Dead out there, to say, hey, I can pick up a camera, I can make this found footage, as we know that's kind of budget friendly when we're making a horror film, and knowing Deadstream is one of those smaller films, that we're able to do something like this. It leans on the physical comedy, but also the physical horror of it as well, and just has those tense moments. And I think because Evil Dead exists, that's certainly why Deadstream exists and is able to thrive in a more modern era.
And for our final unofficial sequel for the Evil Dead franchise, I mean, this has all been in chronological order, so you guys know it's 2026's The Mummy. Yes, Lee Cronin, the man who brought us Evil Dead Rise, just came out this past year with his own modern take, revitalization of the classic Universal's The Mummy. And it wasn't just us, but the broader horror community that when they got a look at this bad boy, when they actually sat down and watched the movie, they said, damn, this feels exactly like an Evil Dead movie.
You can certainly see Lee Cronin kind of applying the Evil Dead's DNA into, I guess, the Universal monsters. Like you said, with our mummy-esque character, you get that tinge of the Deadites, especially looking at the character of Katie being on one side of the door and saying, hey, I want to taste your Tootsies, or whatever the line is.
Like how your little piggies taste.
It's like, that is such a Deadite line, and you could easily see the inspiration that Lee Cronin carried over from Evil Dead Rise into his version of The Mummy, because it really does play with those elements of the supernatural in the sense of what we see with Evil Dead. And I think it feels like he's carrying on the lineage of what he did with Evil Dead rather than just copying it. And again, we see that versatility. This franchise is able to bleed into other films and other franchises seamlessly, and it just feels like a natural narrative to it. And we're able to replicate some of the violence, able to replicate just the narrative in general and the overall tone of something, and also make it their own type of film.
When I sit back and look at this, it's not only just from the visual cues. I mean, if you look at just the grandmother in this movie alone, when she kind of is taken over by these, mummy demon-like things, it's very Henrietta coded. It looks extremely like something straight out of a Sam Raimi film. It's really come down to just a couple of not only Easter eggs that Lee Cronin has put in, but his own words saying that, yes, the Mummy is very much connected to his Evil Dead Rise. They are in the same universe, as so far as to confirm that, a character who plays the archaeologist actually shares the same surname to Beth from Evil Dead Rise.
Excuse me, Mr. Bixler. Can I have a moment of your time?
It's Professor Bixler.
So it's you know, whether they are related somehow, some way through whatever it is exactly, we don't know. But he did confirm that they are tied, and also that just in general, the evil itself in this universe just has the same exact flavor.
Miss Mills,
Yes, Maud.
you're not a frog.
That's correct. I'm not a frog.
You're a rat-faced cunt.
As Evil Dead and all that. And we see it throughout the entire movie. There's a lot of very, you know, kind of goofy, disturbing visual gags. And I'm here for it. I think it really adds something special to this that makes this Mummy stand apart from all the other ones. I mean, it made this movie not just another run-of-the-mill Mummy movie, which really swung for some things. And I think for me and a lot of other Evil Dead fans, it really landed. So it made me excited to really see just how the bloodlines of this franchise have been able to kind of infect horror even to this very day. Well, there you have it, folks. We have reached the end of our 8 unofficial Evil Dead sequels, spin-offs, reboots, however you want to call it. I mean, we kind of hit all the ways in this video that you can really pay homage to a franchise of horror films. And I mean, some cases, not just one. And I kind of love that. I mean, you've said it a few times here, Luke, and I think it's very much the mantra of what Evil Dead has kind of found itself here in kind of, I guess, in a lot of ways, crossing the proverbial finish line and becoming one of the horror greats, because what they've done with films like Evil Dead Rise, all the way back in Evil Dead 2013, with that being, you know, its own flavor. And then Rise being kind of an adjacent thing to that, but having its own taste of stuff. And apparently Burn being that. And it's so great to hear these filmmakers come out and say that, like, this is a franchise that is going to have a lot of sequels and a lot of things tied to it.
What an enigma of a franchise. I mean, as we went through each different pick of ours, which I'm sure we've forgotten some, we want to do some of the heavy hitters. So certainly let us know down below, because I'm sure we have. But we've covered every decade since the Evil Dead's inception with some sort of DNA of the Evil Dead. Is just how it kind of spreads throughout horror. And while things like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street are great, they really did fall into the slasher culture of the 80s, and that's where they pretty much stayed. But when you see Evil Dead, it carved out its own path. This franchise was handled so well that I don't think, you know, it wasn't just a throw another iteration up. We have a clear direction. We've always had a clear direction. This is a franchise. A lot of people will look at this, and I know there's going to be some contention, but a lot of people will say Evil Dead is a perfect franchise. You know, they've had fun with all the different installments. And you can, while there's contention there, you can easily see that with a lot of the other bigger players of, no, they're really bad installments. But it looks like we have such a clear direction and a different voice to each film that has come out and will be coming out, because of just how interesting the lore is, how interesting the texture can be, and all the different creatives that gravitate toward this franchise.
I don't think it can be said any clearer. Evil Dead is truly, in our eyes, a timeless franchise. And yeah, I can't get enough of it. And if this list proves anything, it's that these unofficial sequels, homages, whatever they are, they can give you that same approach, that same feeling in some way or another. And I think that whether it's a direct prop being thrown into the background of some of these to tie it in, or it's actually a filmmaker coming out and saying this was deliberately made this way to tie into Evil Dead, or someone just doing their best to make their favorite horror movie, but in their own language. Evil Dead, the franchise here, it's completely timeless. And yeah, I can't wait to see what's on the horizon. And hopefully Luke and I can throw our own hats in the ring. Maybe one day. I'd love to. I have so many ideas. I love this franchise, but I hope we don't fuck it up if we ever get that opportunity, because that would, so far they're doing great.
We're going to be the first ones. No.
Oh no. Oh God. But anyway, guys, it's going to wrap us up here. So thank you again. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button. Hype this video. This is probably going to tank. Our algorithm hates us when we do something that's not fucked up, disturbing movies. But we'll see. And yeah, I mean, beyond that, we got lots of great stuff on the horizon. So until next time, I'm Dylan Newell.
And I'm Luke Janesco.
And remember, stay scared.
Shit, gonna do it live. Put Splattercast kick it every day they live.